Today I am honoured to be interviewing one of the highest acclaimed politicians in the UK. My guest was born in North London. Both his parents are from Berbice, Guyana. He studied on subjects such as the School of Law, School of Oriental and African Studies at the University of London. He was also the first black student to attend Harvard Law School, achieving a degree in Master of Law. He graduated in 1997. He has served as a Tottenham MP for 20 years and is now the Shadow Secretary of State for Justice for the Labour Party. Ladies and gentlemen, it is the one and only David Lammy. Thank you so much for taking time out of your busy schedule to meet me. How are you doing?
I'm very well today. It's I think, the hottest day of the year on which we're having this interview. So I think we're all a little bit hot, but I'm very pleased to be here. And it's just up the road from me in Tottenham, so very good.
We all understand that all politicians have the responsibility to transform people's lives. Many people also think that politicians have a duty to acknowledge issues facing society such as poverty, education, healthcare, employment and much more. You stated in the Financial Times, "My mother was worried about putting food on the table, but I also knew what it was like to experience love and generosity." So, my first question is, how did these childhood experiences motivate you to become a politician?
I'm definitely a politician hugely shaped by my background, shaped by growing up in what was deemed an inner city area of London in the 1970s, shaped by being raised ostensibly by a single mother, shaped by race and discrimination that she experienced, that my father experienced before he left us at 12, that I experienced, and in a sense that fight for social justice started to be something I thought a lot about. I was a sort of argumentative sort of person. I loved English at school and history. I obviously originally wanted to be a lawyer, but the calling really was to change the world and do something to help people like myself and whatever the colour of their skin or wherever they were growing up in the country or globally. So I think I'm definitely someone called to politics because of social justice, because of alleviating poverty, and because I realise that I have a voice, that I have, I had the power of speech. I loved vocabulary and I learnt to use my voice really, and I've always wanted to use my voice on behalf of others who couldn't use theirs. I'm really aware when I give a speech in the House of Commons that I'm almost speaking on behalf not just of my constituents, but people like my constituents who would love to have the platform of the House of Commons. They would love to be on Question Time. They would love to be on Newsnight saying it as I'm saying it. And so I'm speaking very much on their behalf.
Thank you for such an inspirational insight. The coronavirus pandemic has undoubtedly changed to the world we know. The killing of George Floyd, amongst others, has had a profound global impact. This sparked protests in 60 countries, including Nigeria, Australia, South Africa, Germany, and many more. After watching your appearance on BBC Question Time, I was motivated to interview you on racial injustice. You stated on the programme, "George Floyd looks like us, could be us." But what is striking about this moment is that when you look at the protests, it is black and white, many young people, it's all kinds of people saying, "Enough is enough." In context, racial injustice and discrimination has been going on for decades. Do you agree that the Black Lives Matter movement was inevitable?
Look, I think that the murder of George Floyd in 8 minutes 46 seconds was grim, was horrendous, was unbelievable to watch. But I think somehow reach people in their homes and in their lives globally. Because we're in this coronavirus moment, people were at home watching television, people were watching social media, because the truth is the murder of George Floyd is not new. Eric Garner, Trayvon Martin, a whole host of Americans have died in similar ways in recent times and in the past. But I think it touched a chord because also there's a younger generation of people who are saying enough's enough, and they have a boldness and an articulacy that I find really impressive. They're millennials, they're Generation Y, they're taking to the streets, they're absolutely black and white, and they are called to say something has to change. And that principally is about criminal justice systems around the world, whether people are marching in Sydney or marching here in London. But it's also about escaping a colonial past in which a pecking order was created, in which it was deemed that white men and women were superior to black and brown men and women. And unfortunately, the legacy of that is still with us. It's a very significant moment, I hope, and a historic moment, but there's a hell of a lot to do. And we're having this conversation at a time when there are lots of populist leaders who actually would turn away from this historic moment and are against this historic moment, which I think is also why it's an amplified moment because of people like Donald Trump in our own country, people like Nigel Farage. People feel motivated to fight for social justice once again.
Thank you for that interesting answer. I'm sure you'll agree that the responses to protests have been mixed and extraordinary. In my faith, Islam, we believe that racism is completely intolerable according to the Quran. In Surah Al-Imran, Allah states, "All mankind is from Adam and Eve. An Arab has no superiority over a non-Arab, nor a non-Arab has any superiority over an Arab. Also, a white has no superiority over a black, and vice versa, as long as people have good intentions." This conveys the importance of our politicians acknowledging our voice, valuing all opinions equally. Home Secretary Priti Patel described protests as an unlawful and restless act. However, we also have had other worldly respected figures, like the Duchess of Essex, Harry and Meghan, responding to protests very positively, saying, "It is a movement that brings everyone together that doesn't have a single address or leader. This injustice has occurred for hundreds of decades. This is the time that people get listened to." So, Mr. Lammy, do you think a unifying approach can be more effective in tackling issues on injustice rather than divisive language?
Absolutely. I think that it's important for significant people like the Obamas, like Harry and Meghan, to be engaged and to recognise what is happening in our world. And we want to stay united in this battle. But I think we also have to call out. We have to call out those that are set against this. We have to call out those that use the rhetoric of Black Lives Matter, but in the end, the substance of change doesn't happen. Look, power does not concede change quickly. It has to be demanded, it has to be fought for, and you have to be clear that those with it don't generally want to give it up. And that requires unity, yes, and a strength of purpose, but you have to be prepared to call out those who are standing up against you.
Thank you so much for that answer. Prior to the Black Lives Matter protests, there were several petitions sent to head teachers demanding change through the curriculum and staffing. A group of sixth formers from London urged the government to highlight colonialism in education. BBC Bite Size recorded a Year 8 student expressing her anger as her teacher proclaimed that slavery has nothing to do with race. This statement reinforces the necessity to scrutinize the way Black history is taught in schools. Black Lives Matter campaigners worldwide are demanding for the national curriculum to include colonialism and Black history permanently. On the 8th of June 2020, the statue of 18th slave trader and philanthropist Edward Colston was vandalised in the heart of Bristol. In a BBC News report, Clive Meyer explained that Bristol was one of the cities that ships transported Black people from Caribbean to work in the UK. BBC News footage depicted that when slavery ended, African and Caribbean people were asked to return and rebuild this country. Mr Lammy, do you think this is an uncomfortable part of our history that young people should be taught?
Look, I think for too long we have focused on the two H's in teaching British history. That is Henry VIII and defeating Hitler. And even within discussion of those subjects, we've not really, in exploring Henry VIII through Elizabeth I and the beginning of the colonial period, we've not really been prepared to discuss the truth of that colonisation, the way in which people were taken by force from the continent of Africa, the way in which countries like India were ransacked for goods, and much of Africa was. Even in that defeat of Hitler in the Second World War, the way in which the Commonwealth, the contribution of Indians and Africans have been written out of the story is abominable, thankfully. I've done a documentary on Channel 4, it's called Unremembered, which is about the African contribution to the First World War. It's shocking that most people in Britain do not understand that the first shots of the First World War were not on the Western Front, they were on the Eastern Front in Africa. And that many Africans died fighting for the empire in the First World War. So there are many aspects of that story that have to be told. And even when we tell the story of the abolition of the slave trade, it is not solely a story of Wilberforce. It is a story of resistance, the resistance of black men and women across the Caribbean fighting for their freedom, and those across the wider Commonwealth and Empire fighting for their independence. And until we are prepared to tell those stories, the good and the bad, the warts and all, I'm afraid we're telling a very partial story, and we're hanging on to myths. Myths of superiority, myths of a sort of ethnic-centric sense of what it means to be English or indeed British. And for all of those reasons, it's being rejected. It is deeply, deeply depressing that the statue of Edward Colston was still standing on a plinth, sort of idolised, because that's what you do when you create statues in the 21st century. This was a man who'd killed 19,000 black Africans, it's estimated, during the course of that Middle Passage and the journey from Africa to the Caribbean and North America. So, of course, we've got to get to a place where we're telling a fair history by those who were oppressed, as well as those who did the oppressing.
Thank you for the insightful answer. At the end of the BBC bite-sized clip, students concluded with the goal of our campaign is to introduce a compulsory Key Stage 3 history module on colonialism. In Tribes, you recognise that Britain has consistently ignored its own history of empire and imperialism. I have also witnessed your plead with the government, furthered in the Lammy Review, to act on struggles within the BAME community. Subsequently, do you believe that Boris Johnson and other government leaders could benefit from meeting with Black Lives Matter campaigners to find solutions for racial injustice?
Well, look, I think two things in relation to that. The first thing, of course, once the Black Lives Matter protests and movement begun, those leaders should have been called into number 10 for proper, genuine discussion, dialogue, and then action. And the fact that that hasn't happened is an outrage, frankly. But the second thing is to say that, you know, I've been really clear. What needs to happen in Britain is well understood. What you need to do within the curriculum has been written about for many years. What you need to do in the criminal justice system is contained in my review, but also in many others. There have been countless inquiries, countless reviews, countless reports. The problem is implementing them. And Boris Johnson needs to get on with implementing them, making them happen. Because if you ask someone like me to do a review into the criminal justice system, I spend 2 years working really hard, working cross-party to come up with things that need to happen to improve and change disproportionality in the criminal justice system. The truth is, if people lose faith in me and lose faith in the government taking me seriously, what will they do? Well, they'll take to the streets, they'll riot, they'll smash things up as the only way in which they can be heard. So it's a very serious thing not to get on with the business of implementing reviews, and there have been many of them over the years.
Thank you for that amazing response. Based on my life experiences, I think the opportunity is the key to solving divisive issues. Speaking about complex issues, I would like to now get your perspective on the Windrush scandal. We understand that this process involved 500,000 people from Jamaica, Tobago and other Caribbean countries coming to work in the UK between 1948 and 1978. The MOV empireship was dominated by children that were consequently impacted by the Commonwealth Act, which made them indefinite in the UK. To elaborate more on Windrush, I would like to ask you about the government's response to cases of injustice. On the 26th of April 2016, Amber Rudd resigned after being mislaid by the Home Office Select Committee on Illegal Immigration. According to BBC News, she was unaware about the Home Office removal targets. However, just recently, your leader Keir Starmer sacked Labour's Education Secretary Rebecca Long-Bailey for sharing an article which contained anti-Semitic conspiracy theories. Mr Lammy, what would you say to those in public that lack trust in the government due to these recurring issues?
Look, Windrush was I called it a national day of shame when that story broke, and it remains a shameful, shameful episode. The Windrush were a generation of people who came to this country, gave so much and took so little. It's important to understand that these people were the descendants of enslaved people. They're British citizens because Britain enslaved their ancestors when it took them from the continent of Africa and took them to the Caribbean. And that is why when they came to Britain, they came as part of the British Empire with British passports. Britain forgot its history, and it forgot the deeply inextricable link to those people and the duty of care that it afforded and needed to have towards those people. My ancestors. And it is a scandal that these are people who were denied their pensions, denied their right to housing, denied their right to employment. Some of them were detained, some of them were shipped back to the Caribbean countries that they had left at the age of 2 or 3. And I'm afraid it breaks my heart today that despite people say, well done, David, for bringing this to public attention and for getting the compensation scheme out of the government and the inquiry, the truth is we did have a very good inquiry by Wendy Williams and a very good review. The government has to implement that review. It said it will, but we'll hold them to task. And the second aspect of it is that I'm afraid the compensation scheme they've come up with is miserly, has handed out less than £1 million, and very sadly the standard to which these people have to be met to get any compensation is beyond a reasonable doubt. So they're being treated like criminals, despite the fact that the criminality here is in the hands of the government. So I'm afraid it's deeply, deeply racist. It's a shameful episode, and it's one that I'm afraid I suspect a Labour government will have to return to if we're to get justice.
I completely agree that many complex issues in life may be challenging, but discussing injustice leads to a better understanding of our world. Let us keep on the topic of Windrush. The BBC drama programme, Sitting in Limbo, narrates a story of Anthony Bryan rebelling against the Home Office system. Anthony was threatened deportation after 50 years living in the UK. One of the most disturbing scenes for me was when Anthony violently awoke from a horrific nightmare, where police were invading his home. According to The Guardian, victims of Windrush suffer from conditions such as anxiety, depression, strokes, intergenerational trauma, and many more. Racism is known to create long-lasting negative results on the victim's mental health. You stated the rate of depression in the UK among teenagers has shot up by 70% since the 1990s. Correspondingly, is there a larger responsibility to educate young children on the implications of racist remarks and actions?
Look, it's the duty of every generation, just as we educate them on the dangers of division, we educate them, and we must educate them on issues like the Holocaust. We have to educate them on scientific racism and the decisions that were made to enslave groups of people and subjugate other people across the world, because that is the basis of racism. And we need to do considerably more to take that on. And Britain cannot be great until it does that, in my view.
Thank you for the kind reassurance. Let us discuss more of mental health and the benefit of treating people with empathy and understanding. During my research, I came across a charity called Empathy Club, which defines empathy as an ability to understand each other and sharing feelings of another person. According to studies by Making Caring Common, exposing young people to empathy develops characteristics of resilience such as better communication skills, higher academic achievement, lower likelihood of bullying, and more. When interviewing the world athletic champion Dina Asher-Smith, she quoted, "Having a more educated world will benefit how we treat the environment, animals, and how we treat each other." Do you agree with Dina? And do you think if teaching empathy to youngsters was compulsory, we could build a more compassionate society?
Empathy is the foundation of cooperation, our common humanity. As tough and as hard as some of the questions you're asking me are, because they are the worst aspect of human nature, we ought to remember that love, gentleness, compassion, and absolutely empathy are the best of human nature, and we probably wouldn't still be here as a human race were that not the case. We have to have love beyond just our immediate family, our immediate neighbourhood. We have to have compassion and empathy for people who may appear to be different to us or experiencing different things to us, particularly if they're in far-flung places of the world, but nevertheless are human beings that deserve a degree of dignity and respect. And it is absolutely right that we teach those things and empathise those things to young people.
Speaking about compassion, I would like to now get your views on stop and search. According to the Metropolitan Police, recently from April to the beginning of July, there were 124,000 black people stopped and searched. You know how black people in Britain are now more than 8 times more likely to be stopped and searched than white people. Likewise, in your special report chapter entitled Understanding Blame and Disproportionality, you mentioned, once arrested, black women were less likely than white women to face prosecution. What suggestions have you made to your opposition for making stop and search and the justice system fairer in our society?
Well, look, that's a big question, and I've made lots of recommendations. I think the first thing to say is, look, in this last period, a quarter of all black children have been stopped and searched here in London. And what happens is the efficacy of stop and search, how successful it is it's about 15% successful. So 85% of people who stop and search are doing nothing wrong. If you stop and search a young black man growing up in Hackney 20 times, and all those 20 times he's been doing nothing wrong, guess what? He's going to turn away from the police. He's going to lack trust in the police. When things go wrong, he's not going to want to tell the police. So it's a sort of endless cycle that leads to a very, very despairing place. We did make changes after the 2011 riots in this country to stop and search. Theresa May, in fact, made those changes. I was very disappointed to see her do a U-turn on those changes just 4 years later in 2018. And so we're now in a situation where black communities feel over-policed, where we're alienating young people that we need to be on side, and where there's this myth that it actually works when it doesn't work. I know there's lots of knife crime, I know there's lots of gang crime, but the way to deal with that is not more stop and search. That's not going to solve the problem if it's not intelligence-led. What's going to really solve that problem is dealing with the gangsters who are bringing in drugs from Colombia and across the world, and that isn't the young people growing up in neighbourhoods being stopped and searched. That's men in suits who we ought to be hearing a lot more about what the government and the police are doing to deal with that.
Oh, wow, interesting. Systemic racism is evident with black boys more than 10 times as likely as white boys to be arrested for drug offences, as stated in your review. One of the most popular cases recently was when the husband of Commonwealth gold medalist Bianca William got arrested on 4th Saturday in Maida Vale. Ricardo dos Santos was driving a Mercedes car and told BBC News he was stopped 15 times before. He mentioned in an article published by The Mirror, "We must stop stigmatizing black men and search for more intelligent, long-term solutions to the problems that foster criminal activity. We know from many psychologists that experiences shape people's personalities." On that note, what words of motivation would you give to those that have low confidence due to being mistreated by police?
Well, you know, this is very hard because I understand why you might have low confidence, why you might have anxiety or be anxious, why you might struggle with depression or feel low. What my mother used to say to me when I was feeling low and in those ways is she used to say, live up to your ancestors' prayers. And I've always thought that that is, all of us can think about that. My ancestors, however tough I find it, some of my ancestors would have lost their life, thrown overboard. Many of my ancestors would have faced flogging. Some may have been lynched or castrated. Many would have been separated from their children or would have watched a slave master rape their wife or partner. That was the truth of my ancestors. If I'm living up to my ancestors' prayers, nothing I experience, no discrimination I experience has anything on what they experienced. But they survived. They survived, and that's why I'm here. And I'm here to make things easier for those who will come after me. So I think her phrase was the best. Live up to your ancestors' prayers.
Thank you for those uplifting words. Let's focus more on the policing which is a close matter to your heart. You have been elected in Tottenham for 20 years and witnessed many events. The fatal shooting of Mark Duggan in 2011 in your contingency sparked various nationwide demonstrations. In an article from The Mirror, you expressed being frisked, groped and harassed by the police when walking on streets in Tottenham, aged 12. So, Lammy, can you suggest any ways to improve the relationship between police and public in the UK?
Well, look, I'm a great believer in neighbourhood policing. These are police who are local, they're police who know their neighbourhoods, know their housing estates, know the community, gain the trust of the community and are stationed there over a long period. And it's very, very sad that neighbourhood policing has been cut in Britain, and that what we find often where there are incidents is police coming into an area from another part of town, from another part of the country. I think it's also true that the police have got to represent the country and the community they serve. And it is still the case in Britain, nationally, that just 1% of our police officers are black. And I'm afraid until we have a representative police force, we will have significant problems. It's a little higher here in London, but it is nowhere near the 40% of the broader population here in the city. So there's a lot to do to get that representative police force and to restore neighbourhood policing and local policing, so we don't have a police force, we have a police service.
Those are fantastic suggestions that we hope are taken on board by the government. We are almost at the end of this inspiring interview. On the note of policing, there was a beautiful solution implemented in America a few years ago. In 2013, the city of New Jersey experienced its biggest recession, which led to serious economic challenges. During this time, crime rapidly increased and the Department of Police were under a strain due to abuse and corruption. Therefore, Governor Chris Christie and local officers revolutionized their entire policing services. They created a new public safety department within the Camden County government, requesting for all their staff to reapply for jobs. Due to the transformation of this system, it allowed new initiatives for enhancing the relationship between community and police. CNN showed policemen giving food and ice creams to people, as well as the children high-fiving to policemen. Mr Lammy, do you think activists should meet the Commissioner of Police, Cressida Dick, to discuss ways about improving the relationship between communities and police?
Absolutely. I'm not into creating a situation in which we demonise all police officers. Most of the police officers I've met are public servants wanting to do a great job, and many of them do a great job. And so I think it's really important to sit down together to continue the dialogue and discussion about these issues, to work together. And I certainly want young children growing up in urban communities like the one I represent feeling empowered to join the police force to make it better.
Thank you for such an amazing answer. I'm sure many of the viewers watching would agree that unity and compassion are key to tackling racial injustice. We have come to the end of the interview. I would like to finish on a positive note. Politics is often portrayed in a negative light, but I believe that real politicians are elected to serve their communities. There have been many politicians that speak out for their constituents and do great things for them. So, in an ever more divisive world, what final words of encouragement can you give the public to have belief in their politicians?
Well, look, my experience is that no political party is the font of all ideas. I am very proud to be a member of the Labour Party and to be politically on the centre-left of the political spectrum. But I would say that it is important to find consensus where you can, to try not to be overly partisan, and good faith is important, to assume the best of people, and that includes the best of your political opponents. And you talked about empathy previously. Empathy is important, and most politicians in my experience are people motivated to leave behind a better world than the one they came into, even though we arrive at things in different ways. So occasionally, very occasionally, there are dangerous individuals that get into positions of power, and the world is seeing a little bit of that at the moment. But on the whole, the motives are pure, the motives are good, and therefore we have to find common purpose and common endeavour, and we have to focus on what we share and what we have in common, and not on what divides us.
What an inspirational note to end on. Thank you so much for doing this spectacular interview and giving amazing answers. I really appreciate it. There were so many topics to cover: your upbringing, political system, prison rates, coronavirus, poverty, and more. However, I think racial injustice is the most imperative at this difficult time. Would you be interested in doing another interview in the long future at your convenience?
Well, Javed, I've very much enjoyed this interview. Thank you very much. And yes, of course, I'm very happy to come back and do another interview down the line.
Okay, great. I'd be honoured. Mr Lammy, thank you so much for your time today. I really appreciate it.